For joining us this evening on a Friday for an awesome webinar. My name is Ethan Banner. I am the Chair Select of the Student Affairs Committee for the Society for Military Psychology. We are excited to host a webinar tonight and have some fantastic presenters talk about moral injury. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly direct you all to two websites. First, I'd request that you all check out our Facebook page so you guys get further invites and updates on events that we host and things that we do within the division. This is the easiest way that we can keep in contact with everybody. We also have a listserv, so we would recommend that you reach out to us through our website or via email so that you all can stay up to date on the things that we do. And we post monthly email blasts, so those are helpful to stay up to date as well. I'd also like to direct you all to our Division Student Affairs Committee website. And on the homepage, you will find an announcement blurb as well as student research projects that are happening across the country. I really encourage everybody to take an opportunity to take a look at that and see if there is any research projects that they would apply for themselves or be able to be a participant in. It's really important that we can continue to kind of fuel student research that's happening across the country for dissertations or master's theses and things like that. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Afiq, one of our virtual project officers. He's worked really hard to set this up, and I thank him dearly. So Afiq, if you want to go ahead and take it away, you can introduce our presenter tonight and we can get started.
All right. Can anyone hear me? Can just write in the chat box if you can hear me. Perfect. Thanks, Dan. So, welcome everyone. My name is Afiq and I am the virtual project officer for Division 19 Student Affairs Committee. And for today, we have very, very special guests. Two speakers. The first speaker is Shira Magen. Dr. Magen is a professor at the Department of Psychiatry, UCSF. She's the mental health director of the Post-9/11 Integrated Care Clinic and staff psychologist on the PTSD clinical team at the San Francisco VA healthcare system. Her research interests fall under the umbrella of PTSD, moral injury, and suicide, including veteran risk and resilience factor. She is the author of over 100 peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Magen received 2 VA grants examining the impact of killing in war and moral injury. Her work resulted in the development of a killing-related cognition scale and a novel treatment to address moral injury called impact of killing. Together with Dr. Magen, we have Dr. Christine Berkman. Dr. Berkman is an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UCSF School of Medicine and a staff psychologist in the Substance Use and PTSD Clinic at the San Francisco VA healthcare system. She provides direct clinical service and supervision for predoctoral and postdoctoral trainees in the assessment and treatment of co-occurring trauma and substance use with a focus on complex and developmental trauma. Dr. Berkman served as a study therapist on the Impact of Killing pilot trial and played an integral role in developing of Impact of Killing manual and related training materials. So thank you very much for showing up. Thank you for the presenters. And now I'm going to pass the microphone to our two presenters.
Thank you so much, Afiq. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Can you guys just also make sure that...
Dr. Magen, could you turn your voice?
Oh. Okay, can you guys hear me now? Hello?
Yes, now.
Okay, great. Excellent. So I was just saying thank you so much for the introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. We're really excited. Chris and I are going to give you an overview of the work that we've been doing over several years. And I wanted to just start because to me it's really important to also talk about why we started to do this work and what inspired us to start asking some of the research questions that we're going to talk about today. So I'll talk a little bit about our experience and my experience, and start out with my experience in particular, And then Chris will also talk about hers in the latter half of the presentation today. So I began working at the VA in 2001, actually, and I was first at the Boston VA before I came to the San Francisco VA. At that time, we were just starting to see the veterans from OIF and OEF who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Middle East coming back. And one of the things that we were noticing is that when we were using evidence-based psychotherapies for PTSD, including cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapies, that those were helping people, but there still seemed to be an area of the war experience that was unaddressed and continued to really bother people and have a direct impact on their well-being and functioning. And so the more I started to talk to patients, the more I was able to understand that a lot of people who had killed in war really struggled with that and felt like they didn't deserve to share that, and they had to kind of take that to the grave with them. And so really began to think about the larger context of that and how what we were currently using to treat PTSD, if there were missing pieces of people's experiences that we weren't capturing. And so that really got the ball rolling for me. And when I started to look in the literature about what existed in particular about the impact of killing in war, at that time in 2001, there really wasn't very much out there in the literature. And at that same time, there was a New Yorker piece that was published that was by Dan Baum, and it talked about killing in war in particular, and specifically mentioned that the VA wasn't addressing it directly. So that really coincided with what I was noticing while I was working at the VA, and I started to become very interested in better understanding the impact of killing in war. And really what was most important to me is that, the veterans' experiences that I was sitting in the room with, that guided my understanding of this topic. And so really it was their sharing with me what they'd experienced and the ways in which they were still struggling that opened up the door to studying the impact of killing in war and more broadly moral injury. And so at the time, really what we wanted to start to do is have a ground-up understanding of the impact of killing in war and really hear in the veterans' voices how they were struggling with some of these things. And so what we began by doing is running focus groups, and by that time I'd moved to the San Francisco VA, and we really did focus groups for veterans of all eras to understand their experiences. And those were really important to a lot of the consequent development of our thinking about killing in war, and also how we conceptualized what could be helpful in next steps in treatment. So I think that was really, for me, what started this whole line of inquiry. And it was looking for information and really not finding much out there at the time, and then really being inspired to grow the literature and grow our understanding of how we conceptualize how to help veterans when they come back from war. So hopefully that helps with a little bit of the background. And then it was exciting because it was an exciting time to be working in this area, because in 2009 people were starting to think and talk more about moral injury with the publication of some of the conceptual models, and Chris and I began working very closely together to develop a treatment that I'm going to be talking about today, that we're going to be talking about today, called the impact of killing, or IOK. So our thinking about this really grew out of conceptual understandings of moral injury and experiences of veterans, and them giving us feedback directly. So hopefully that helps a little bit with a background of how we got to where we are today. And so I also like to start out by presenting some statistics about killing in war. And so I'm going to start talking about the impact of killing in war, and then I'm going to expand out to talking about how this fits into our conceptual understanding of moral injury, and then some of the research that's been done, and then we're really going to delve into talking about some of the clinical examples and our treatment in particular, and how that was developed. So first, to start off with, about 77 to 87% of those who served in Iraq reported directing fire at the enemy, with about half reporting being responsible for the death of an enemy combatant, and close to a third being responsible for the death of a non-combatant. And if we look at these numbers, they're actually quite similar from veterans who served in Iraq and also veterans who served in Vietnam as well. So as I mentioned, we really wanted to start from the ground up, and I talked a little bit about the qualitative work that we had done with the focus groups, but we also did a lot of quantitative work, and I've included a lot of the articles that we published as part of what you can access on Adobe, and so I know Afik has kindly put that up for people to access. So all of the articles that I'm going to reference today are going to be available to you all if you want more information. But what we found was, when we looked at this quantitatively, we looked at 3 different eras in 3 large databases. And so we looked at Vietnam, we looked at Iraq, veterans who had served in Iraq, and we also looked at the Gulf War. And what we found was that veterans from multiple eras who killed in war were at increased risk not only for PTSD, but a number of other conditions, including alcohol abuse, suicide, and functional difficulties after returning home from war. So what we found was that in those cases, even after adjusting for being in combat more generally, killing still predicted many of these outcomes. And so the other thing that was important for us is that we knew, because we worked in the VA system, is that killing is not routinely assessed by the VA or DoD. So those are questions that are not asked specifically of all veterans and all military personnel. And there's not a clear treatment trajectory after evidence-based psychotherapies about what to do if people continue to be impaired by killing and moral injury. So in addition to the work that I very briefly summarized, I wanted to just show some data here. The next question that we wanted to answer is we wanted to look at types of PTSD, and so we did a latent class analysis here, and we found that these are veterans who served in Iraq, soldiers who served in Iraq particularly, and we found that that really they fell into 4 different groups. So those with low symptoms, those with medium symptoms, and high and low emotional numbing, and then those with high level of symptoms. And we found that those who killed, so 75% of veterans who killed in war were at the worst PTSD levels and worst PTSD groups. So that was important for us. These were the veterans that were having the highest symptoms, and that really also helped frame our thinking about how to treat these veterans. So I also want to present a little bit of work about what we found in the focus groups that we did. I'll say that Chris is going to talk about this a little bit later on, but one of the things that we learned from the focus groups was areas in which people continue to suffer and some of their cognitions or attributions based on killing in war. And so I'll also say up front that it's important to acknowledge that not everyone who kills in war continues to have distress due to killing or develop moral injury, but we were really focused on the individuals that did, so that we could best inform how to help those individuals. So one of the things that the killing focus groups serve to help us with is with the KCS, which is a measure that we developed that really honed in on what were the cognitions that people were having who were struggling with the aftermath of killing in war. And so we'll talk more about that when we get to the treatment as well, and Chris will focus on that a little bit more. I'll also mention that what I'm going to talk about here briefly with the focus groups is also available to Natalie Purcell, who's a sociologist that we work closely with, is someone who is the first author on that, and so the Purcell article is part of what you have available to you as well, and it's in your packet. So the first theme that emerged in the focus groups was the dark side of the self. So it's this idea that veterans who killed in war and suffer from that really have the ability to see the dark side of the self. You can see here that one of the quotations talks about, you kind of feel like a monster. What I'm capable of doing is what scares me. and just the acknowledgement of what you're capable of doing and what that means about the person came up quite a bit. The next theme, there was a lot of discussion about secrecy, so a lot of people felt like they had this experience and really weren't allowed to talk about this with other people and what it would mean if they actually shared with family members or friends that they had killed in war. So I think here this really kind of gets at the heart of the matter. I always thought that if I talked about some of those things and people on the street would think that I was crazy, that was reinforced because the media and the Vietnam that's being called baby killers, it was better not to tell anyone. So again, there were very real ramifications for people and sharing their experiences and not wanting to reinforce some of the stereotypes and also feeling like there was no room to discuss some of these deepest experiences that people had gone through. And then just, you can see here below too, feeling like there was a lot of ambivalence about telling family members. On one hand, wanting to share with family about what you had experienced. On the other hand, feeling like you'd be judged for that and not knowing how to negotiate that sometimes was challenging. So as a result of that, there was a lot of withdrawal and feeling like you couldn't share about these things and that you had to really keep those secret. So finally, that ties directly into moral injuries, the topic of morality. I think these are some really important quotations. Your morality gets tossed out the window. Same thing with religion, because I think once you start thinking about it, boy, I can't do this because this is against everything I've been taught or believed in since I was a young person. When you start thinking about the moral issue, you'd be dead. You don't have time to think about those things. You just do it. And again, it's hard to be a soldier. It tears away at your moral fiber. It changes your life. So I think really the moral struggle that people felt around feeling like you had to cross some line and feeling like this was something that you needed to do to protect yourself and the people that you cared about, yet it really felt like there were struggles on the other end of that, and feeling like people had to come to terms with what it meant, and really having what they did change their life in profound ways. So I think it's not an accident that the issue of spirituality and religion came up here too, around the issues of morality, and those are ones that we hear about all the time in the treatment as well. So I think the next thing that I want to highlight is oftentimes we get asked, well, how is killing trauma different from PTSD trauma? And so this really helps me when I'm talking and thinking about this issue, and so I wanted to share it with all of you. So while with PTSD trauma, we really think about the violence from the other person being directed at the self, with killing trauma, that's reversed. So the violence from the self is directed at the other, so that the person is really a participant in the trauma instead of a recipient in the trauma. With killing trauma, there is not only fear-based response to trauma, which is most typical of PTSD trauma, although we know it's more complex. With killing trauma, there is fear and also anger and loss-based responses to trauma, and so oftentimes a killing might occur in the context of losing someone close to you and also feeling anger at what's going on in war as well. So it's a very complex and intricate response to trauma, and particularly to killing trauma. So with killing trauma, there's a lot of activation and moral conflict, while with PTSD-based trauma, there's a lot of helplessness and self-protection. So, and clearly there's a lot of overlapping areas as well, so including life threat, numbing and dissociation, and physiological arousal as well. So I wanted to now broaden the lens a bit and talk about how killing fits into how we're defining moral injury. So the paper that we wrote in 2009, which is also available to all of you, is the definition here of moral injury is perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held morals, beliefs, and expectations. So with moral injury, again, there has to be a line that gets crossed, that the transgression that occurs really contradicts personal or shared expectations about the rules or codes of conduct. So the way that we see killing fitting into this in particular is that killing is one of many potentially morally injurious events that can happen, and that this is something that we really want to understand when we think about the framework of moral injury. So I want to now just kind of put up the causal framework for moral injury that we use in thinking about this. And so I think that there is a transgression that occurs that we talked about, that can be killing or any other event. It can be witnessing, it can be learning about things that are disturbing to the person. There has to be some dissonance or conflict. There have to be some attributions, and that's really what when we think about the KCS, the Killing Cognition Scale that we're going to talk about, those are the things that, the cognitions that people identify that continue to bother them. So because I killed, I don't deserve to be happy or have a family. You know, because I killed in war, I don't deserve to be part of a spiritual community. So all of those things that come up for people are the internal and global attributions that get made. As a result, shame and guilt develops, the person withdraws, and that there is a profound failure to self-forgive or self-condemnation. A lot of how our treatment differs. So the IOK is based on the person having some prior evidence-based psychotherapy, but the way that we differ in particular is that we address the forgiveness, the self-forgiveness in particular, very head-on in the treatment, and Chris will talk a little bit later on about that today. But I think these are kind of the key pieces of how we see intervention for the impact of killing and moral injury needing to happen. So in addressing the attributions and in addressing the failure to self-forgive, and then directly also addressing the self-harming behaviors that happen and the demoralization that happens. And so this is a treatment that focuses on functioning and functional impairment very directly. So we very clearly ask about the relationships that are happening and how people's functioning is impacted in the areas of work, in the areas of their family life, with their children, and with work and school as well, in their day-to-day functioning. So, so out of this grew the impact of killing module. It's a standalone treatment that really comes after a CBT treatment, which we conceptualize it as a sort of a secondary treatment that comes after some trauma processing. And so this is something that's important for us, that we wouldn't want to give this treatment as a first-line treatment, but that the person first has to deal with some of the trauma that they've experienced, and that doesn't have to be dealing directly with their killing-related trauma, but we like to have some basis so that we can delve in more deeply using some of the CBT principles. So I'm very briefly going to talk about a pilot study that we did with IOK, and then Chris is going to talk to you about IOK in particular. So the RCT pilot is also available as one of the articles. We included 33 combat veterans. They were randomized to either receive the IOK, the impact of killing treatment, or to be in a waitlist control. All those who were in the waitlist control then got offered the main treatment. We involved veterans that were 26 to 80 years old. Our oldest veteran had served in Korea. Participants were participated in 6 to 8 sessions of individual psychotherapy, and it was 60 to 90 minutes each week, again really matching what we typically see in EBPs that we provide here at the VA. And we also asked participants to complete assessment measures that I'll be talking about briefly, and then to also provide feedback regarding the treatment. So they gave qualitative feedback, which that article has also been published and is available as well for people who are interested. So it's important to note too that this is we started out with 6 to 8 sessions. We ended up later on expanding to 8 to 10 sessions, and we'll cover that a little bit later on. So what we found is that veterans, after going through IOK, experience a significant improvement in PTSD symptoms, but not only in PTSD symptoms, but also general psychiatric symptoms, and I'll show you some of those results in a second. They also improved in quality of life and functional measures. So importantly, they also reported that the treatment was acceptable and feasible to them. So I'm going to quickly just show you some results from the treatment versus the wait list. So you can see here that the PCL score decreased significantly and was different from the wait list group. In addition to that, anxiety went down. Depression also decreased significantly. We also saw improvements in obsessive compulsive symptoms, as well as some symptoms that tapped into phobia. And finally, again, I'm just providing a little bit of an overview here, and if you want more information, please feel free to follow up with the article that was referenced. But some of the KCS sample items that changed was some examples here where I deserve to suffer for killing, so people significantly changed on that item. I feel betrayed by my superiors who ordered me to kill against my own beliefs, and I can no longer be intimate with a partner after killing. Okay, so I'm going to now pass over the baton to Chris Berkman, who's going to lead you through the specifics of IOK treatment.
Thanks, Shira, and hi everyone. I'm really glad to get to be here today to talk in a little more detail about the impact of killing treatment that we've developed over the last several years. So like Shira, I started in the VA really working with evidence-based treatments for PTSD, and it's actually here at San Francisco in 2010 and 11 for internship and postdoc. And got to see combat veterans, primarily who also had co-occurring substance use problems. And what I was really struck by was I could see major improvement in some of their PTSD symptoms. I saw them get sober, and yet there was still this ongoing kind of self-punishing, self-condemning set of behaviors that seemed to persist even after some really meaningful gains. Folks were still really struggling and suffering. And so this idea of moral injury and specifically the impact of killing, which definitely came up in a lot of the work that I was doing, really resonated with me. So I was thrilled to get to join Shira and do the pilot with her. And so one thing that we did, what you're looking at now, is actually our revised model. It's now a 10-session treatment. It started out as 6 to 8. And what we did following the pilot was get feedback from all of the veteran participants, which totaled 29. So all the members of the wait list, many opted to do the treatment as well, and all of them were very generous with their time and gave us detailed feedback about what they found most helpful, what was least helpful, and kind of what they thought we should really focus on. We also provided the materials to several colleagues with a lot of experience with trauma work, and asked them to review and give us feedback about what they thought could work, what might get in the way, and we analyzed both of those sets of qualitative data to inform kind of how we made these changes. So what you see now is the treatment as we are going to be using it in a new multi-site study. So we're going to be working with sites in different parts of the country to do another larger pilot to look at this. So we're really excited about how this is shaping up. So to take you through it, I'm going to try to cover as much as I can while still being brief and mindful of the time. I could talk about this a lot. So starting with session 1, this really reflects what Shira was referring to, that we see this as kind of a second line treatment. So we really focus on what work has the veteran already done, both within formal therapy as well as what have they done outside of therapy in terms of spirituality or family or community, and get a sense of what's worked. where the strengths are, where the resilience is that they've already found, so we can use that and really honor that, as well as what could be getting in the way. So we really anticipate that the stigma, shame, and secrecy could get in the way of the work moving forward. So we spend a lot of time really exploring that in the first session. And there's a huge emphasis on the self-care plan and use of coping skills. Again, we're hoping people have had some experience learning how to manage intense emotions. And it's actually very, very hard for veterans with moral injury to engage in self-care. So we spend some time focusing on how can we help them kind of do that while they're doing this difficult work. At the end of session 1, we give them the KCS, the Killing Cognition Scale, and that's in part because each veteran has such a different experience, and there's so many aspects to their cultural, spiritual, kind of family upbringing that shape their morality that's going to be unique to them. So the KCS is kind of our first line of which beliefs, which feelings, reactions did they have, and which ones did not apply. So we do that in the first session, and then sessions 2 and 3 are really based in the focus groups that Shira discussed, and we share with veterans, these are reactions that a lot of combat veterans have shared with us. And so we really want to get a sense of what applies to you and what doesn't apply to you. Again, really focusing on tailoring the experience to their unit, their era, as well as kind of who they were prior to service. We also found, and again, this was referenced earlier, how little formal assessment is done with killing. One thing veterans shared with us was how important it was for the providers to initiate the conversation. That when providers didn't ask about killing, veterans worried that it wasn't an appropriate topic for therapy, or they were concerned that the clinician wouldn't be able to handle it. This was actually supported by some of the provider feedback that shared. Some of our providers indicated that they were trained not to ask about killing out of concern for seeming insensitive or voyeuristic in some way. And so by sharing a wide range of responses, we're really trying to take the onus off of the veteran to initiate the conversation, and we're trying to communicate that a lot of veterans struggle with these reactions, and they can opt in or out of how much they want to share with us, but the provider is taking the onus and the responsibility to initiate these sometimes very difficult conversations. So at the end of session 3, after we have the KCS and we are diligently figuring out what aspects fit and don't fit with the veteran, we give them their first assignment, which I'll show you in the next slide in a bit more detail. But we ask them to write a statement about the meaning of killing in their life. So in what ways did it change them and change how they saw themselves and different aspects of their life. And those 3 things really help us map out the next several sessions. So moving into sessions 4 and 5, this is where having a previous CBT framework can be really, really helpful, because we go through thoughts, feelings, and there's a much stronger emphasis on behaviors, because we're finding, if you think back to that model, the LITS model, the behaviors really drive a lot of the kind of self-condemnation aspects and failure to forgive. So we have a large focus on that. But this is where we start to differentiate distorted beliefs that can be challenged, that can be worked with to try to create maybe a more balanced view. So there's more context that can be helpful in ways that are very similar to some of the existing evidence-based treatments that work beautifully with other types of trauma. We also acknowledge and start to suss out beliefs, statements that are areas for acceptance and self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others. These are statements that reflect individuals' morality, humanity, their truest sense of right and wrong. And so to challenge that would be invalidating. So we're really trying to pull apart through these next several sessions what can be challenged to a more balanced view, and what do we need to earmark for forgiveness work. When we move into session 6, we expand a little bit more based on some of what the focus groups raised in terms of some of the beliefs of kind of the wounding of the soul, this idea that individuals betrayed themselves. So we really look at the role of betrayal in moral injury, the violation of one's own moral self, as well as feeling betrayed by the institutions, such as the military, feeling betrayed by God, feeling betrayed by humanity when they came home and feeling really alienated, as well as looking at all of the related aftermath of that wound, the ways in which I'm thinking of a lot of the Vietnam veterans that I've worked with, and we've worked with in this study, sometimes decades of substance use and separation from family, and a lot of behaviors that just fed this belief that there's something very tainted or wrong with them at their core. So we spend some time really pulling that apart so that we understand the areas of forgiveness that we're going to need to go into. When we get to session 7, we assign a statement about forgiveness, because what we found is it's so specific to each individual that we need to understand how they define forgiveness, and particularly self-forgiveness. And in those definitions, we really start to understand individuals' sense of morality, spirituality, and we get a lot of information about the barriers to self-forgiveness, the beliefs about what would happen if they forgave themselves or forgave others. And so that gets us started into the development of the forgiveness plan, and there's a couple different exercises that we work on to understand these different barriers. And we are really encouraging veterans to get to this point where they understand the function of self-forgiveness, because we don't feel it's the provider's place to tell them whether they deserve or don't deserve forgiveness. Oops, moved forward too quick. We are really just trying to help them understand the impact of what it means in their life to forgive or not forgive. And that leads us to session 9, the taking the next step, where we're really trying to focus, again, going back to functioning and behavior. What can they do in their life that honors the values that they have? Often the barriers to self-forgiveness reflect core moral beliefs about what it means to be a good person. And so how do we support them in building behaviors that honor that? And often that means helping get them connected to others, whether that's veteran groups, connection with nature, spiritual communities, volunteering with people, with animals, whatever makes sense for that individual. But we want to get them active and connected. And then our final session really focuses on the importance of that healing as a process, that we do not expect this treatment to be the end of the road. We see it as a catalyst. And our goal is to really help veterans understand the scope and the magnitude of what forgiveness entails, and to build in as much support as they can get moving forward so that they can continue to work on this really challenging process. So moving forward, we wanted to just give you, just so you had some sense of what the Killing Cognition Scale looked like. These are some of the categories that have been sussed out with different beliefs, and I would just highlight a couple. You can look at it in more detail. But really looking at the contamination and self-loathing, this idea that individuals feel forever tainted because of killing, or the moral violation, like no good person would have done what I did, spiritual disillusionment, where was God when the killing happened, a lot of self-disgust, this idea that they are really disturbed. This goes back to the guilt up top, having feelings they should not have had, or feeling a rush when they killed. And again, going back to the slide Shira showed, the Venn diagram of killing trauma, this idea that there's a complicated mix of fear and anger, and kind of all that's entailed in war and in killing others, that there's a wide range of physiological responses that can then be interpreted and evaluated for years as an indication that there's something really wrong or evil about that person. And then finally, the bottom one, going back to that idea of self-betrayal, that they can't trust their own anger, so there's a real pull to withdraw and not be around others, and especially loved ones, because they fear themselves, versus the withdrawal that you see in maybe more classic fear-based PTSD, where they withdraw because the other is dangerous. What we see in the impact of killing is they withdraw because they're worried that the self is dangerous to others, and they're trying to protect others. Okay, so we wanted to just also give you a sense of some of the homework assignments that come along. It's not exhaustive. It's just some ideas to kind of give you a little bit more kind of hands-on practical idea of what we do. So with the meaning statement, this is back after session 3, kind of the general themes that often come out have to do with alienation, anger, fear, loss, and really a lot of beliefs around the self-view. So right from the beginning, we're really looking at what themes do we need to work in, and where are you listening for possible distortions, beliefs that are pretty prone to challenging, and where are there beliefs or statements that really reflect a sense of genuine and authentic guilt, remorse, and an area that requires forgiveness work and grief work. Looking at the ABCD worksheets, I think I already mentioned this, so I'll just say very briefly, again, we really want to focus on the behaviors and the ways in which individuals continue to stay stuck in a pretty self-destructive or self-punishing headspace. So those are the sheets that we use for the CBT-based interventions in sessions 4 to 5. And then I want to share a couple things about the forgiveness plan. So after we get individual definitions of what forgiveness is, and oftentimes what gets in the way, we do a couple different exercises. One is pretty basic. It's this idea of what are the pros and cons to self-forgiveness, which really highlight kind of the functional nature of what would forgiveness allow them to have in their life. And oftentimes veterans identify a greater ability to connect with others. Some of them are able to acknowledge that they've suffered enough. Others aren't there yet. But some can acknowledge that it's been a long time of punishing themselves, and that they're really identifying wanting peace. And then it's also really important to identify and label the cons, their perceived ideas of what would be wrong about forgiving themselves. And very often it's not wanting to condone what they did, not wanting to forget, because there's a fear that if they forget, it dishonors those who were killed or wounded or hurt or disrespected. So really a sense of trying to honor the humanity of those killed. And then, hands down in terms of the feedback and the reason why we extended the forgiveness section significantly more, we actually added another session just to look at forgiveness, was because veterans said the forgiveness letters were hands down the hardest exercise, but definitely the most powerful. And so what we usually do is have them write multiple. And the first is to the individual that was killed or injured. And then we often have them write additional letters depending on what seems to make sense. But we often have the individual killed as well as a letter from present-day self to younger self asking for forgiveness. And this really speaks to kind of the years of self-punishment and sometimes destruction that come following the moral injury. So what I'd like to do now is actually just read a composite that we developed from several veterans' letters. So this isn't any individual veteran's letter, but it is probably 3 or 4 kind of combined together, and we think it resonates with the general gist of what we get. So it starts, I don't know your name, but I'm sure you had one. I have no idea how to start a letter like this other than to just come out with it. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I know you understand that we had to kill to stay alive in war, and you probably would have killed me if you had the chance. But I know I scared you, taunted you, and made your last few moments on earth painful, and I was cruel. I'm so sorry for that. I know this doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to know that to me, you were one of them. And after we found Joe like that, I just wanted you all dead. I could see the disgust in your eyes when you looked at me, and it only fueled my rage. My rage for being in Vietnam, my rage for being shot at every day, for losing men I would have died for having to walk through bodies on a daily basis. And yet you probably felt the same way. You were a kid, probably younger than I was. Did you hate me? Or did you just hate the war we were both stuck in? The miserable waste of human life. Did you have a family? Probably. I'm sorry that you never saw them again, and I wonder if you thought of them before you died. I wonder how they must have felt when they found out you were dead. Maybe you lost friends too. Please know that I am not the type of person who wants others to suffer. I will regret forever how I treated you, but I am not that man, that kid, that scared, angry, lost kid who was so pissed and sad and fed up with all of the bullshit of war and took it out on you. I hope you know that I think about you and your family all the time. I hope you can understand that I forgive you too. I forgive the kids caught up in a fight that I don't think was theirs. I hope you have found peace, and I hope I can too. So what we found in a lot of the forgiveness letters, especially to enemies killed, was the importance of veterans acknowledging the specific things they did that they are struggling to forgive themselves for, and to highlight who they truly are, what they would wish to have happened, because that often reflects, their true core moral self, and that shapes the kind of final phase, and that's the action plan honoring those values. So that's the amends plan that we do after session 9, with session 9, which is really focused on reconnection and re-engagement in spirituality, humanity, and self. So time with families, time with veterans, self-care, nature, trips, activities. A lot of veterans describe the importance of doing pilgrimages. So either returning to important sites or doing some sort of ritual to honor the dead and honor kind of the loss that they're grappling with. And definitely a lot of veterans wrestling with. We get a lot of support, and we encourage veterans to seek out support through chaplain services, through community spiritual leaders, to explore their continued spiritual conflict and hopefully get support so that they can re-engage with spiritual practice if that's something that's really meaningful to them. So looking at kind of what we found, this actually goes back to the pilot, and Shira and I developed this because we were finding they were describing things that weren't quite captured on some of the measures that we had chosen, like the PCL or the BSI, which were some of the findings Shira shared. And we again went back to the model that Shira kind of grounded all of this work in, which is just listening to the veterans and what are they saying is helpful. And so this is what they were telling us changed through the course of the treatment is increased self-compassion, having a bit more understanding of what contributed to the killing and the responses to killing, feeling closer to others like family and fellow veterans. Some lessened conflict in spirituality. Again, we don't see full resolution, but we see a start. More connection to society, more accepting of self and the dark side, the multiple sides of self, a better understanding of what self-forgiveness means to them. We don't have to come to a universal agreement of what it is, but the veteran has a sense of what it is and why they can or can't forgive. Recognition that healing is a process. And specific things. This was really important to us, and we were really pleased to see how many veterans identified that there are specific things that they can do to continue to work on their healing as they move forward. And then finally, again, this is just kind of recapping additional feedback, just this idea that we're seeing greater self-forgiveness, self-compassion, self-acceptance, and more understanding. And so that's it. So this would be the time for questions. I'm going to tap Shira back in here.
Thank you. Here, why don't we do this? Here, we're going to
share your phone.
Yeah, we're going to hopefully both be on here. And I apologize too for my poor ability to sort of look at chat and speak at the same time. So I haven't been able to look at necessarily what's going on, but I'm sure we will get to some of those questions as well. So I wanted to just very, very briefly thank you slide up because a lot of people obviously contributed to this, and there was a lot of funding that helped us as well. And I just wanted to end by putting up our emails in case anyone has any follow-up that we don't get to today. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. McGinn and Dr. Berkman. We have one question from Kate asking, do you view the IOK as a treatment for veteran population exclusively, or would it also be appropriate for forensic psych populations?
That's a great question. So I think really a lot of the groundwork that we have done focuses on a veteran population and particularly killing in war. But I think that, as, we're in our sort of moral injury research is in its infancy, and I think that there are definitely applications to forensic populations. And I know one of the things that Chris and I have done is visited
a prison where we were able to talk to people about their experiences. These were veterans who were in prison who we talked to, but certainly I think that there are many things that cut across civilian populations as well. But I think something like, I can see something like IOK being done, but I think it would have to really be a process where you would work. I mean, I'm a big believer in mixed methods, and so I think that you would want to do focus groups and understand the unique issues to that particular population, and understand their unique cognitions, etc. So I think we can learn a lot from IOK from those populations, but I wouldn't say that in its current form it would be able to be applied to those groups.
I would agree. I think we've talked to a lot of really exciting potential partners, including like the police, child welfare services. There's a lot of potential applications that this could benefit. And again, one piece of feedback that we got over and over and over again was the importance of the specificity and an attunement to the specific experience of killing and war. So I would agree with Shira that before any IOK could be used in any other population, you'd really need to get specifics with that population about specific things that they struggle with. But yeah, I think it could work in a lot of different ways.
Thank you. So another question is, how do you think this will correlate into OAF veterans?
So I think that, one of the things that was very important to us is that when we did focus groups, that was a group that was included, and so their voices were very much a part of the development of this work. In addition to that, they were included in the trials that the RCT that we presented, the pilot trial. We are also funded now to do IOK in 2 other sites, one that's in the south and one that's on the East Coast. And so we're definitely also going to be using the treatment with veterans at those locations as well. And so I think, as Chris was mentioning, one of the things that's most important to us is that we have written IOK so that it can be flexible to the unique needs of the veteran. So in addition to ERA, the other things that we really try and better understand about each veteran that comes through the door is their racial and ethnic background, their spiritual background, and all the factors that contribute to sort of who they are as a person, and really try to tailor the treatment then to meet the needs of that particular person. So as an example, even when we're thinking about self-forgiveness, we really try to understand what is their understanding of this concept, and in all the cultural ways that they have understood it up until the point that they've gone to today. So basically, we do think that this will be able to be used with Iraq and Afghanistan and veterans who have served in the Middle East and have already begun to do so. And we're always open to kind of hearing thoughts about people about how this can be even honed to a larger extent with veterans of all different eras.
Thank you. Taylor is asking, so these veterans are most likely currently, if they're not being treated with IOK, they are most likely receiving CPT or PE. Is there anything in the works to compare the IOK to CPT or PE?
Do you want to take this?
Sure. No, not currently. I mean, because IOK, we'd like to, ideally it would come after CPT or PE. With the pilot study, most of those veterans had completed either CPT or PE, and sometimes they worked on the killing trauma, but often it wasn't the killing trauma. So at this point, we haven't had any plans to compare them head-on, because we didn't really conceptualize it as a replacement for CPT or PE, but more something that complementary that could continue to.
Right, and so I think the current trial that we have, we're comparing it to present-centered treatment for PTSD, and very much as Chris was saying, I think that we see this as a treatment that could be used in conjunction with evidence-based psychotherapies. I could see in the future at some point we might want to go that route, but we're not quite there yet. So I think we have the first step for us is really comparing it to a non-trauma focused treatment. And I think down the line we'd be very open to doing that.
Thank you. Another question we have from Jordan is, will there be any workshops to train others in IOK?
So that is very much the hope. So I think that what we are doing with our current trial is we're going to be having workshops to train providers at those sites, at those 2 sites, as a starting point. And then we hope to, as the trial gets more progressed, we hope the goal and the hope is very much to be able to do that in more sites. But, implementation science is a long and complicated route sometimes, and so we're aware of the fact that we want to do this in a very paced way, and so I think our thinking about this has always been we do a step and then we grow and learn from that, we make it better, and then we kind of take the next step. And so I think that that is very much our goal down the line, and we hope to get there and to be able to train down the line as many people as possible.
Agreed.
Another question from Seth. What effects has reading or viewing the accounts of other veterans had? Seth described it some films and books that they have reviewed, described very eloquently the inner turmoil of vets that have either killed or ordered others to do so. And Seth thinks that these accounts can be helpful.
Sure. I absolutely. I've actually seen it go both ways. So my first response is it depends. I think for some veterans, there's been certain books or films or documentaries that have meant so much to them because they saw another veteran describe something that they thought they were totally alone in. And when that's the case, we really encourage them to bring it in so that we can discuss it and kind of understand even more what touched them about that. For others, I think it just kind of depends on how much work they've done. Some, I think, try to watch too much too soon without enough support. But that said, that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be helpful at some point. It's just we're always on the lookout for any sort of self-punishing behavior. So we're pretty cautious sometimes when veterans want to watch pretty heavy, especially if there's a lot of kind of graphic details of combat or killing during the process, if that makes sense.
I'll also add that one of the things that we have observed is when people are ready and do so in a really supportive environment, it can be really helpful. So we had one veteran who wanted to share what he wrote with his group. And so he brought that. This is a group that he had been in for a while and felt very comfortable in. And it really inspired people to see the progress that he had made. They had seen him change and in the treatment, and so he sort of shared his forgiveness letter with them, and that was a very important piece for him because he was bringing that to the group as a way of not being isolated anymore and sharing his internal experience. So.
And his ability to share that and kind of work through shame allowed other group members to work through theirs. And then actually we worked with another 2 members of that group in the study.
Exactly. So I think
really powerful.
Yeah, it can be very powerful and help veterans connect. And I think one of the biggest issue with killing has been the isolation and people not feeling comfortable talking about it. So it can be quite powerful for someone who, when they're ready in the right environment to share and read some of the work that they have really poured their souls into. I mean, I think the other thing that I want to say here is what tremendous respect we have for the veterans who do this work with us and how humbled we are on a regular basis to be in the room while someone is growing and sharing their experience in this way. So I think that that's also something that this question really speaks to, that it can really help with moving people forward and inspiring others to share their stories as well.
I'm going to jump on here real fast to ask a question that kind of some people that I'm with right now had We're curious to know if you all believe killing is the only creator of moral injury, or if there are other things that create moral injury, and if those are more impactful than killing in some situations.
So yeah, it's a great question. So we conceptualize killing as a very important piece of moral injury, but that's also why we kind of started talking about killing, but then broadened the lens to talk about other potentially moral injurious events, just through the definition. So we think that absolutely the series of things that make up potentially morally injurious events is much more broad than killing. And so that includes witnessing, learning about the death of another, losing someone close to you in a difficult way. And so in the context of war. And so I think that that lens is very broad. In our experience, killing has just been one of the most difficult things for people to bring up and talk about, because it involved them doing something to oftentimes hurt or kill another person. And so it's the most challenging one to talk about, and sometimes the one that as a result causes a lot of functional difficulties. I think in terms of comparing head to head, I think that the field is really in its infancy in terms of being able to do that, to say people really suffer most in who witness, or people really suffer most who have killed. We are collecting data as we speak right now about looking at the different types of moral injury and what causes people to suffer or have the most mental health symptoms. So we'll be able to look at that down the line for sure. But I think at this point, it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly which is the worst. But we know that certainly killing, from the people that we've worked with and seen, are very troubled, and that it's associated with a lot of difficulty in functioning in spirituality. So that's kind of where we've chosen to focus. And I'll also add that people in general who have killed also have a number of other moral injurious events that generally come up during the course of our treatment. So while killing is oftentimes a focus, we will deal with a lot of other ones that come up as well during the IOK treatment.
Yeah, I would say anecdotally, any individual might have more or less distress of any particular event once we get started in the treatment. There's something about the hurdle of talking about killing that seems to open things up. And if we can talk about killing, then additional morally injurious events, other actions they've taken that they're deeply, deeply remorseful of, will come out in the course of treatment that, depending on the individual, they may report greater distress at the non-killing event. But I'm not sure we would have gotten there if we hadn't started at the killing event, if that makes sense.
Agreed. And yeah, I think that because killing doesn't happen in a vacuum, there's always generally other events around it, including loss and witnessing difficult things as well.
Or doing additional difficult things.
Right,
yeah.
Doing additional difficult things. So all of those are definitely ones that we deal with within this context, with starting to talk about the impact of killing.
Okay, so we have another question from Kate. Did you find any differences in KCS scores or IOK outcomes among the different methods of killing, like direct weapon fire or long range, rockets, drones, etc.?
We don't have enough people yet to be able to look at that quite yet. We're hopeful.
Yes, we're with IOK we're not powered to do that, but we are looking at some survey data. We're collecting data, as I mentioned, to kind of survey data to look at some of these questions that have come up. And in those surveys, we have very detailed questions about different methods, like different killing experiences, basically. And we'll be able to look at that question down the line in terms of mental health impact. But like Chris was saying, we're just not powered to be able to do that in the pilot trial.
We have another question from Jordan. With the thought of moral injury and how it can potentially poison or stain a memory due to maladaptive cognitive network being created? Is there a way that conceptualizes the intervention going forward to deal with moralistic or moral injuries related to veterans who have experienced MST or toxic leadership, betrayal from a leader or peer, etc.?
Yeah, so great question. So conceptually, definitely, leadership, betrayal, and MST are really important topics and issues that come up for veterans that oftentimes may come up in the context of this treatment and are dealt with in that context. But I don't know. I think IOK, again, we start from the context of talking about killing, and I think when you open that up, other betrayals do come up, and we're certainly prepared to talk about those as well. But I think that one of the things that's emerged from some of the other research we've done with EBPs is that MST is something that can be dealt with fairly well within the context of CPT and PE, and now I think there's also a lot of complementary and integrative treatments that are being done with people with MST as well to broaden that lens. So I think, the bottom line here is that absolutely there are really challenging betrayal cognitions that come up for people who are suffering from MST as well as betrayal from leadership. We can look at those within the context of IOK, but I also think that that's not unique to IOK. I think you can also look at those within the context of other treatments, other treatments that are cognitive behaviorally focused. So hopefully that helps.
Okay. Ryan asks if you can recommend any further therapist resources for self-forgiveness.
Yes, definitely. So we, one of the things that we can do too is maybe get some additional self-forgiveness articles to you and post those. I know that one of the colleagues that we work closely with here, Brandon Griffin, his specialty is self-forgiveness, and he's done research in that area. So if the person who is interested can email me, I will, maybe the easiest thing to do is I can get those resources to that individual. So if you email me at the address, I will definitely get those to you. So for example, I know that I'll just briefly say too that there's a handbook of self-forgiveness that is just put out in a chapter that was specifically focused on self-forgiveness and moral injury, so I can pass that along too if whoever is interested can email me.
All right. We have a question from, let's see. Jordan asks, when defining remorse in context of the intervention, is it synonymous with guilt and or shame, or is it unique?
So can you say that one more time? So defining remorse in the context of the intervention.
Right.
Okay, got it.
I mean, the first thought off the top of my head is it depends on how the veteran's using it. So we definitely differentiate between guilt and shame. Guilt being grounded in a specific action, that they feel guilt towards shame really being more of the identity of I am shameful, kind of more global. So I don't know that I wouldn't say it's necessarily synonymous, but my first thought is I'd want to ask the veteran how they understand the feeling of remorse.
Absolutely right. And so I think really starting again we ask veterans to a lot of times to just explain how they're thinking about these things or how they're defining it. And so that's true of remorse. It's true of spirituality. We had a few Native American veterans, for example, participate. And what was so critical to us was understanding how their culture impacted how they thought about remorse, about self-forgiveness. And so really it was a critical piece is like we want to see these things through their eyes, and that we want to make sure that we're having the conversations around how they conceptualize all of these topics. And so I think that that's a really important starting point for us. And so for some people, remorse really is going to be about the shameful, how they see themselves. And for other people, it's going to be about what they did and feeling remorseful because of an action that they did and that they feel guilty about. So I think can see it really going either way, depending on how the person is thinking about it.
Another question for Jordan. Is there any measure of therapeutic alliance regarding the intervention?
So that's so funny. That we actually have
You're in our brain.
Yeah, Chris and I have actually spent a lot of time for the new trial looking for alliance interventions, alliance measures, and we think we've settled on one, but
if people have good ones, let us know.
Yes, we are very open to if you have one that you think would fit for this intervention. I think the one that we have settled on kind of gets at some of the issues around difficulty of disclosure and feeling like you can do that, feeling like one of the key pieces for us is that we believe that part of the healing occurs within the context of that therapeutic relationship and how the person is feeling like they're being witnessed or how they feel like they're being perceived. And so these are really critical questions for us. And we actually, it's one of the things that we talked about with people when we got the feedback, when we did the feedback interviews, very clearly about the therapist alliance. And so now we're looking for sort of measures to really do that outside of interviews, basically, with a measure. And so that's a work in progress for sure.
But very helpful. The veteran feedback we got around Alliance was very helpful in our figuring out how to proceed with the training in terms of kind of what's most effective for the therapists in terms of their stance and how they approach these topics. So again, just profound gratitude for the veteran participants who shared so much with us.
Yes, absolutely. I also see there was a question about drones.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to go back to that.
Yeah. I think Seth was saying that he's heard a great deal from drone operators. There's a delay, but they can get affected very profoundly. That's absolutely right. And, I think that, in terms of how this can potentially generalize, we definitely think that we would love to work with more drone operators. And I think it's, again, nuanced in terms of how it's different for people. I think the key for us is that people come to us when they are distressed about killing. And so I agree that there can be a delay, but that drone operators can be very impacted. And there's a New York Times Magazine article that came out in the last few months by AL Press that sort of shares, the perspective of several drone operators. I encourage people to read that for that perspective if you have not done so already. So,
and we have included people, and we're currently working with people who are drone operators or worked for intelligence. And the key here is that they feel morally responsible for the deaths of others, and it's causing them profound distress. So speaking to Shira's point that they come to us, if they feel responsible for killing, then that's what needs to be treated, however it happens.
Right. And I think, we get asked all the time this question about does the killing have to be direct? And it absolutely doesn't. And so it can be direct, but it can also be, people can be very, very much affected if they order others to kill, if they feel responsible for the death of another person. So the way that we define killing is very much a broad definition, and it really includes the person's perspective. So if they come and they feel like they've killed, then that's something that we can work with. We've also, in addition to drone operators, we have also worked with individuals who have been medics and feel like they killed someone because they couldn't save them.
Or they were ordered not to.
Or they were ordered not to save someone, and as a result, they feel like they killed another person. So I think that's really important to mention here as well.
Yeah. I'm glad you went back to that.
Of course.
We had another question from Mike. That's kind of a big question, though.
Okay.
Based on your research and experience, how do you recommend active duty psychologists to prepare service members for going overseas and fulfilling their duties and roles as combatants?
Yeah, definitely a big question. Yes, an important one, a very important one. I think that we know the other end of it, and so I think it's what we would do here is pure speculation. I think that I would say here that it's very important for us to actually better understand those contexts before we make those kinds of recommendations, because what I've learned is that for different MOSs, it's going to be very different. So, we've talked to some snipers, we've talked to people in just different contexts, and context is so important to answering this question. And so I feel like if someone put me on this task of how would I do this or respond to this in terms of the active duty psychologist, I would feel like, again, I would need to start from the ground up and go and talk to people in the different contexts in which the killing occurred, because I think each of those are going to be different.
So different. And it's weird. I'm having this strange parallel process, but there's like a group member that often says, what keeps me sober might make you drunk. And I'm thinking about this question, like what would be protective for one individual could be quite harmful for another in terms of how to prepare. So I really think the ground up would be very important, because I think it's going to be different for different folks.
Right. Yeah. And I think that this is, I think it's a beautiful question in that we're not only struggling with this in this area, but we're also struggling with this in terms of PTSD and a number of other ways as well. So I think that what I would want to do here is learn more from veterans. And we've asked veterans in retrospect, like, what would have been helpful to you? And I think that that's how we can learn most about what we do to intervene early on. I think what we hear a lot is nothing can prepare you for killing, and so you can get the best training and you can get the best preparation, and when you're in that situation, I've just heard over and over again, nothing can prepare you. So it's just interesting. I think I would want to learn a lot more about that if my duty was to kind of intervene in that way.
Agreed. A lot more work.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. McGann and Dr. Berkman. This has been a fantastic and super relevant webinar.
Thank you.
And we want to remind everyone that if you have any further questions, then Dr. McGann and Dr. Berkman's emails are on the screen right now. And if you have any more questions regarding the webinar series itself, you can email the Student Affair Committee of Division 19 email, or check our Facebook site. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in our future webinars.
Thank you. I also just want to really thank everyone for listening in and for the great questions. Really, truly wonderful questions that you all had, and we really appreciated the discussion and welcome future discussions. So thanks for having us on, and
thank you.
And we look forward to hearing from some of you after this.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.